Hi, in this short video, we will discuss what is discourse, the difference between text and discourse, what is the difference between literary and non-literary discourse, and the concept of discourse and its interpretation by linguists and literary critics. So let's start. When we look at the etymology of this word, we find that the word discourse has been derived from the Latin discursus. And the meaning of this word discursus is to run true and true. Whereas if we want to define the term discourse, then discourse is a symbolic human interaction which includes both verbal and non-verbal communication. When we talk about the verbal communication, it includes both oral and written communication. And when we study non-verbal communication, we take into consideration gestures, symbols, signs, etc. So basically, when we talk about verbal or non-verbal communication, and when verbal and non-verbal communication, they communicate some meaning to us, then it is known as discourse. So the term meaning is deeply associated with the word discourse, and we will look at this in the future slides as well. When we say that discourse, and particularly when we take into consideration the Latin root discursus and its meaning to run true and true, the concept of Saussurean sign comes to my mind. Saussure, in his course in general linguistic, at one place says everything depends upon relations. And why I said that discursus is related to associated with Saussurean sign, because Saussure says that a sign interacts with another sign and then it gets its meaning. So the relationship between one sign and another sign is relational. How they interact with each other and how they generate meaningfulness. And this is how they generate meaningfulness. So when we look at the meaning of this Latin root discursus, it says to run to and through. That is to say that in a text there are words, and those words are actually interacting with each other, not only syntagmatically but also paradigmatically as well. And that's how the entire text becomes meaningful, it becomes a discourse. To move further, we have various views that are related to the scope of linguistics, and one such view is by Bloomfield. Bloomfield argues that linguistics is only concerned with those phonological, lexical, and syntactic features which the utterances share. He felt it was no concern of linguistics to explain how identical utterances can have different functions in different situations. So, the descriptive linguistics, according to Bloomfield, is concerned with phonology, morphology, and syntax. Phonology is the substance, whereas morphology and syntax is the form. And it is not the work of a linguist to study discourse, which is related to meaning. But contrary to the view posited by Bloomfield in 1933, we have a view by Firth, and what Firth says that language is only meaningful in its context of situation. That is to say, discourse is important if we are studying a language, because phonology, morphology, and syntax, they simply study substance and form, and that is their limitation, that is their scope. But language is not only form, but language is beyond form, and that is the meaning that is associated with discourse. So here we have two different type of views that are associated. What is the study, what is the scope of linguistics, and what is not. And one is one camp says that only phonology, morphology, and syntax, they are they are the part of linguistics, whereas another camp says that how can you how can you leave out discourse, because without meaningfulness, how can you study a language? To extend the differences between two camps, we have Chomsky's views, and he expressed his views in his book Syntactic Structures in 1957. And Chomsky argues that the fundamental aim in the linguistic analysis of a language L is to separate the grammatical sequences, which are sentences of L, from the ungrammatical sequences, which are not the sentences of L, and to study the structure of the grammatical sequences. Again, when we talk about Chomsky's view and what he expressed, and he said very clearly that the fundamental aim in the linguistic analysis of a language is grammatical sequences, and that are sentences. So again, we are stopping at syntax. We are not moving beyond syntax. And language is basically meaningful. Language occurs in discourse. Contrary to the view expressed by Chomsky in 1957, in the late 1960s, Ross, Macaulay, and Lakoff, they began arguing that one cannot in fact describe grammar in isolation from meaning. Again, meaning is so much important for the study of language. We can't leave it out. We need to include meaning if we want to study language. That is basically the idea, and because of the argument posited by Ross, Macaulay, Lakoff, and Firth, discourse as a proper field of study came into existence. And not only linguists, but literary critics, they also started treating discourse as a serious discipline of study. Now, to move further and to look to look into what is discourse, particularly what is a literary discourse and what is a non-literary discourse, there is a term associated, that is text and textuality. What is text? Written or printed work in terms of content rather than physical form. So here we have a uh, difference between a physical form and the content, something that has a content. When we talk about content, we are talking about meaningfulness. And when we talk about meaningfulness, then obviously we are talking about discourse. Now, to look at how a text gets textuality, and or what is textuality as such. In textuality, there is a suffix ity, and the meaning of this suffix ity is quality of being something. So quality of being a text is known as textuality. Text as a physical form we can see, but that physical form is not that important. What is important is that physical form, what that physical form is conveying to us, whether it is a meaningful discourse or not. So when a text becomes meaningful, there are two possibilities as well. It can be informative, it can be fictional, it can be in the form of a narrative, it can be in a form of a story. So informative, fictionalized, narrative, all these things are associated with text. A text is informative, at the same time a text is written in literary style. So we will study different types of text and which are those texts that qualify for literary discourse and which are those texts that qualify for non-literary discourse. But to answer this question that where do we find a text, then context comes into being. We find a text in a context. So a text becomes a text because there is a context. So a text does not occur in isolation. It occurs in a context. Now take this example. There are two sentences. Wash and core 6 apples, put them in a bowl. These sentences or this particular example is taken from Halliday and Hassan's Cohesion in English. Now, as you can see here, this is a subjectless sentences, and we know that a subjectless sentence in English is an imperative sentence. When someone is instructing you, when someone is requesting you, when someone is uh, rebuking you. So these are subjectless sentences we have. Wash and core 6 apples, put them in a bowl. Now the word them, that is an anaphor, looks for its meaning, and for that it crosses its boundary. It crosses its sentence boundary and it gets its meaning from 6 apples. So we can say that there is a cohesive relations across sentence boundary here. 6 apples works as an antecedent to them. This antecedent, it's giving its meaning to them. Now this is a text, but what is the context? The context is not knowable. If the context is not knowable, then this text is not meaningful to us. Let's say I meet you in the morning and I say wash and core 6 apples, put them in a bowl. You will wonder that why I'm saying this. Do you understand the meaning of these sentences? But the context is not knowable to you. When the context is not knowable to you, then it remains a text, but it will not convert into a discourse. But assume a situation, I am telling you a recipe from a cookbook, and I say wash, the first thing is wash and core 6 apples, put them in a bowl. Now the context is knowable. So the text is transferred into a discourse. So text transforms into a discourse when context is knowable. Whereas any text becomes a text, or text realizes itself into a text when there is some context. And there is a possibility sometimes context is not known to you, then it simply remains a text. But when context is knowable, it becomes discourse. Now, when I talk about this knowability, that means the knowability of language, the knowability of situation, the knowability of the relationship between speaker A and B, and the knowability of all the past knowledge that two people or more than two people they have. That is to say that only when you have a concrete living totality, according to Bakhtin, then the text transforms into discourse. And when I talk about this concrete living totality, then I am talking about all such things that are associated with a text, and you take those things into consideration in order to make a particular text meaningful to you. So this is how a text transforms into a discourse. Now let's uh, come to the discussion on what is a literary text and what is non-literary text. Jonathan Culler, in his book Literary Theory, a very short introduction, raises this question: what makes a text literature? Or we can also say, what is a literary text or discourse and how it is different from non-literary text and discourse. Now, there are different views associated with this. One such view says literary text, they are associated with narratives, they are associated with storytellings, and they contain elements of fiction. So we have a novel, we have a poetry, we have short stories, we have drama. In drama, short stories, poetry, novel, we have elements of fiction, we have narratives, and we have storytelling. But what about prose? What about biographies? What about letters? What about speeches? What about essays? What about autobiographies? Because in autobiography, in essay, in a letter, in a speech, we do not find narrative. We are not telling a story. And there is very little chance that they contain elements of fiction. So the purpose of prose, particularly essay, letter writing, speech, biography, is a purpose of conveying information. This fictionalized element, narrative, is missing. At the same time, in textbook, in legal documents, in articles published in academic journals, in recipe books, how to cook books, instructional manuals, we do not find this fictionalized element, we do not find narratives, but they are quite informative. We find information. So this is one view, and this view says that when you have narrative, storytelling, or elements of fiction, then you can consider those texts as literary, and if you have simply information, then you can consider those texts non-literary. But this is a limited definition. And in this context, Gerard Janet states that literature is the art of language. A work is literary only if it uses the linguistic medium exclusively or essentially. Now, this is uh, this is again a very narrow definition. Literature is the art of language. What does it mean? It means that even the graphic novels are not literary. Why? Because in graphic novel, though you have fictionalized elements, though you have storytelling, though you have a narrative, but still you use graphics. And similarly the case with films, because in films you have dialogues, but at the same time you have let's say uh, let's say uh, let's say a screen where people are talking to each other. You can view them, and lots of action is going on in the background. Music is also there, and a lot more things are happening. So this is a bit rigid definition that what is a literary text and what is a literary discourse if we follow Gerard Janet definition. But we also look into what Culler says. Jonathan Culler says both literary and non-literary works can be studied together and in similar ways. So again, Culler is not making a difference between a literary and non-literary works, but Culler is Culler is saying that if you want to study, if you want to analyze literary or non-literary text, the way of analysis, the way how you study them, is more or less similar. So uh, this is how we can make a statement that though there are certain definitions which are quite narrow while defining literary and non-literary discourse or literary or non-literary text, but still at present juncture in the departments of languages and literature, we study both types of text because as a researcher we are more concerned about the way how literary and non-literary texts are to be studied, and they are studied together in the similar ways. So there is a lot of a mingling of both the fields, and we try to make this literary field more richer with our researches and with this multidisciplinary approach. So in this lecture we have discussed the difference between text and discourse. Then we have discussed what is a literary text and discourse and how it is different from non-literary text and discourse, and we will see other such things in future video. Thank you for watching.